The world is watching a 34-kilometer strip of water strangle the global economy, and the most powerful navy on Earth is stuck in a standoff it did not see coming. Right now, as you read this, over 150 ships are anchored and waiting outside the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude oil has already surged past $126 a barrel at its peak. The International Energy Agency's own director is on camera calling this the single greatest energy security challenge in the entire history of the world oil market. Not a challenge, not a crisis, the greatest. And America's carrier strike groups, its destroyers, its A-10 Thunderbolts, and its Apache gunships are all sitting in the middle of it, unable to force open a waterway just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, because Iran, a country that Washington spent decades trying to strangle economically, built something the Pentagon never fully prepared for: a layered asymmetric missile and maritime denial system so deeply embedded into the coastline of the Persian Gulf that the US Navy cannot simply steam through it without calculating a catastrophic cost. That is the conversation Washington does not want to have openly, but we are going to have it right now. Let us begin where everything begins, with context and with honesty. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a series of surprise airstrikes on Iran. They targeted military and government sites, and they assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with several other senior Iranian officials. These strikes came, and this detail matters enormously, during negotiations between Iran and the US regarding Iran's nuclear program. Let that land for a moment. Iran was at the negotiating table. The United States chose bombs, and Iran's response was not collapse. It was not submission. Iran's response was to reach for the one weapon it had spent decades quietly sharpening: control of the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been largely blocked by Iran since February 28, 2026. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait, boarded and attacked merchant ships, and laid sea mines in the waterway. By March 2nd, the IRGC officially confirmed the strait was closed. By March 4th, Iranian commanders declared complete control, and the global economy began to bleed immediately. Not slowly, not theoretically. It bled in real time, at gas pumps, at grocery stores, in shipping terminals from Rotterdam to Singapore to Karachi. Now, here is where you have to understand what the Sajjil-3, or Sajjil, spelled differently, but the same weapon, actually represents in this picture. Because this is not just a missile. This is a statement of doctrine. The Sajjil is a family of Iranian solid-fueled intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Unlike other Iranian missiles, the Sajjil bears no resemblance to any North Korean, Russian, Chinese, or Pakistani missile technology. It is an indigenous Iranian creation. That fact alone should cause serious strategic analysts in Washington to pause and reflect. Former director of Israel's ballistic missile defense organization, Uzi Rubin, called it a significant leap in Iran's missile capabilities, stating the Sajjil places Iran in the realm of multiple stage missiles, which means they are on the way to having intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities. And what makes it specifically terrifying in the context of Hormuz? The Sajjil is a two-stage solid-fuel surface-to-surface ballistic missile designed to provide Tehran with a rapid reaction long-range strike capability. Unlike older Iranian missiles, such as the Shahab series, which rely on liquid fuel propulsion, the Sajjil uses solid propellant in both stages. Why does that matter? Because solid fuel missiles do not require extended preparation time before launch. Solid fuel propulsion allows the missile to remain stored fully fueled, enabling launch on short notice from mobile platforms. This characteristic complicates detection by surveillance assets and limits opportunities for preemptive strikes against launch units. You cannot easily find it, and you cannot easily kill it before it kills you. That is the equation the US Navy is dealing with on this coastline right now. Sajjil missiles are believed to carry warheads weighing roughly 500 to 1,000 kilograms, with a reported accuracy that can reach within tens of meters, depending on guidance systems. And from an operational perspective, open source assessments estimate the operational range of the Sajjil between approximately 2,000 and 2,500 kilometers. From Iranian territory, this range places much of the Middle East within reach, including Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and several US military bases deployed across the region. An American carrier strike group sitting in the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman is not outside that envelope. It never was. The Americans knew this going in, and yet they went in anyway without adequately addressing the Hormuz variable. The Trump administration underestimated Iran's willingness to shut down the strait prior to launching the war. a move that could have likely been prevented if the US had positioned military assets nearby at the outset to deter or respond to Tehran doing so, according to two sources familiar with the initial planning for the war. Read that sentence again, read it a second time. The most powerful military on the planet went to war with a country that had publicly and repeatedly threatened to close the world's most critical energy choke point. And the planners did not adequately account for that scenario. This is not a minor intelligence failure. This is a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. Failing to prevent Iran from effectively closing the strait during the initial days of the war has ultimately led to the current standoff between the two countries, as tankers largely remain unwilling to risk transiting the waterway due to fear of attack. And that standoff is not abstract. It translates directly into suffering for ordinary people in the Gulf states, across Asia, and yes, right here inside the United States. Gas prices at American pumps hit $4 a gallon by March 31st. That is a 30% surge from where they were. Every American filling their tank is paying the price for a war that was launched without a coherent exit strategy. Now let us talk about the economic devastation in real numbers, because this is where the geopolitical and the personal intersect most brutally. The 2026 Iran war, including the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, has led to what the International Energy Agency has characterized as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The conflict has echoed the 1970s energy crisis through acute supply shortages, currency volatility, inflation, and heightened risks of stagflation and recession. We are not talking about a regional inconvenience. We are talking about a global economic earthquake. Oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates collectively dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by March 10th, and by at least 10 million barrels per day as of March 12th. Brent crude oil prices surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026 for the first time in 4 years, rising to $126 per barrel at its peak. The largest ever monthly increase in oil prices occurred in March 2026. The closure of the strait has been the largest disruption to world energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis, as well as the largest in the history of the world oil market. Let that sink in. Larger than the Arab oil embargo, larger than the Iranian Revolution, larger than the Gulf War. Every comparable event in modern economic history pales against what is happening right now in that 21-mile channel of water between Iran and Oman, and it goes far beyond oil. The maritime blockade triggered a concurrent grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples, resulting in a 40 to 120% spike in consumer prices. Iran also struck desalination plants, the source of virtually all drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar. We are talking about a situation where human beings in the Gulf are scrambling for food and water because Washington and Tel Aviv decided to launch a war without thinking through what Iran would do in response. Meanwhile, the energy crisis is reshaping the entire architecture of global trade in ways that will persist long after any ceasefire. The de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz is prompting Asian countries to seek cheap crude that is readily available, and Russian crude falls into this category. Russia, the country Washington has spent years trying to economically isolate, is emerging as one of the primary beneficiaries of this conflict. The unintended consequence of American military action in Iran is the economic rehabilitation of Moscow's oil export machine. You cannot make this up. The geopolitical ironies are so thick you could cut them. India appears more vulnerable to supply shocks. Its oil imports fell in March, and it has a limited buffer of around 30 days against prolonged supply shocks. Meanwhile, China is dependent on the critical waterway for 45 to 50% of its crude imports, according to Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. China absorbs nearly a third of all oil that flowed through Hormuz in peacetime. Beijing is watching this conflict with an intensity that goes far beyond diplomatic concern. Every day the strait remains closed is a day that accelerates China's drive to diversify its energy supply chains away from waterways that Washington can threaten or disrupt. If there is a long-term strategic loser in this confrontation, it may well be American influence over global energy architecture rather than Iranian military capability. Now let us return to the naval standoff, because this is where the story gets most revealing about American power and its limits. Trump declared victory multiple times. He said on March 9th that Iran's military had been destroyed and the strait had reopened. It had not. US President Donald Trump falsely claimed on March 9, 2026, that Iran's military had been destroyed and that the strait had reopened, saying the US would take control of it from Iran. The claim was false when he made it, and everyone in the region knew it was false. The IRGC was still firing on ships, mines were still floating in the water, tanker captains were still refusing to move. On March 19, 2026, the United States began an aerial campaign against Iranian targets to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. On March 17th, U.S. Central Command announced it had employed multiple GBU-72 5,000-pound penetrator munitions on underground missile silos along the Iranian coast near the strait, penetrating layers of rock and concrete to destroy underground bunkers which stored Iran's cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles. And yet, even after all of that bombing, even after assassinating Iran's top naval commander Alireza Tangsiri, even after weeks of sustained military operations, the shutdown has caused massive ripples in the global economy, threatening to undermine President Trump's efforts to reduce US inflation, and has occurred despite a ceasefire pausing US strikes. This is the central admission that the American strategic community cannot fully bring itself to voice publicly. The most expensive military in human history, with 2 carrier strike groups in theater with A-10s and Apaches and B-2 stealth bombers and guided munitions that can punch through reinforced concrete, cannot force open a body of water 21 miles wide against an adversary that has spent decades engineering a denial system specifically designed to prevent exactly that outcome. The Sajjil-3 missiles and the broader Iranian anti-access architecture have achieved what Tehran always promised they would achieve. They have made the cost of American military action prohibitively high, not in a single dramatic naval battle, but in a slow, grinding strategic checkmate that plays out in ceasefire negotiations and diplomatic ultimatums that keep getting ignored. While the ceasefire means US and Israeli airstrikes have stopped in Iran and Tehran's missiles and drones no longer target the region, the maritime standoff continues and could escalate. Without any diplomatic agreement, the attacks will likely deter ships from even attempting to pass through the waterway, further tightening the chokehold on global energy supplies. Even with a ceasefire nominally in place, the strait remains closed. Tanker operators are not moving, insurance underwriters are not writing policies. The chokehold has not been broken, it has merely been paused, and incompletely at that. In the first 24 hours after the blockade took effect on April 13th, CENTCOM reported that over 10,000 US personnel, supported by more than a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, were enforcing the operation. The US imposed its own counter-blockade of Iranian ports. So now you have a dual blockade, where Iran is blockading the Gulf and America is blockading Iran, and neither side can win cleanly, and the global economy is bleeding from both directions simultaneously. Iran's Speaker of Parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf called Washington's blockade ignorant and foolish, saying Tehran would not allow others to transit the strait if its own ships were blocked. And that is a perfectly coherent strategic position. Iran is saying, you want to strangle us economically, we will strangle the world energetically, and let us see who blinks first. The vital maritime passage, through which an average 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products were shipped every day before the war, is currently under a double blockade, with neither Iran nor the US allowing the other free navigation. The IEA's chief Fatih Birol said plainly that Europe gets about 75% of its jet fuel from refineries in the Middle East, and this is basically now zero. Europe is trying to get it from the US and Nigeria. We are weeks away from jet fuel shortages in major European airports. Airlines are already rerouting around the Middle East entirely, burning more fuel and extending travel times across the entire Eurasian air corridor. What you are watching unfold is not simply a military conflict. It is an accelerated restructuring of the entire post-Cold War energy and geopolitical order. The American strategy of maximum pressure on Iran, which dates back to the first Trump term and was revived at the opening of the second, has produced its maximally pressurized outcome. It produced a war that America launched without fully accounting for the consequences. And those consequences are now rippling outward through every supply chain, every energy market, every grocery store, and every diplomatic relationship that the United States depends on to sustain its global position. The Iranian missile program, the Sajjil, the Khaybar-Shekan, the Khorramshahr, the Fatah hypersonic development, was never just a regional deterrence tool. By 2024 to 2026, Iran abandoned GPS signals, which are vulnerable to electronic warfare, in favor of the Chinese navigation system Beidou 3, radically changing the accuracy picture for its entire missile force. The old analysis that called Iranian missiles weapons of terror because of low accuracy became obsolete precisely when American planners needed it to still be true. Iran's missiles got better. Iran's guidance systems improved. Iran's deployment doctrines became more sophisticated. And the Sajjil sat at the top of all of it, a domestically engineered, solid-fueled, mobile, fast-launching ballistic missile that no defense system in the region can intercept with complete confidence when fired in salvos alongside other systems. Iran officially deployed the Sajjil ballistic missile for the first time in active combat during Wave 54 of its military operations. The missile, nicknamed the dancing missile for its evasive maneuvers, reportedly struck strategic infrastructure. The dancing missile. Think about that nickname for a moment. A missile that maneuvers in flight to evade interception. A solid fuel, domestically engineered, maneuvering ballistic missile that was built by Iranian engineers without copying anyone else's blueprint. That is what the US Navy is operating against in the waters just below the Iranian coastline. And the naval standoff reflects that reality with complete honesty, even if the press briefings do not. The deeper lesson here, the one that students of history and geopolitics need to absorb, is that the architecture of American military supremacy was built to fight yesterday's adversaries in yesterday's strategic environments. Carrier strike groups were designed to project power against adversaries who could not afford the anti-access systems necessary to counter them. A complete cessation of oil exports from the Gulf region amounts to removing close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market, about 80% of which is shipped to Asia. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas modeled that a closure removing 20% of global oil supplies during second quarter 2026 is expected to raise WTI oil prices to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. That is a global recession. That is what the combination of American military action and Iranian asymmetric response has placed on the table. And the most devastating part of this entire picture is the admission embedded in the CNN reporting that the Trump administration underestimated Iran's willingness to close the strait. In other words, American leadership looked at everything Iran had built, everything Iran had said publicly about what it would do if attacked, and decided Iran was bluffing. Iran was not bluffing. Iran had never been bluffing. Iran had been building quietly and methodically for decades, precisely for the moment that came on February 28, 2026. And when that moment arrived, the IRGC executed its doctrine with the kind of operational discipline that even adversaries have to acknowledge. The Strait of Hormuz today is not just a waterway. It is a mirror. It reflects the limits of unilateral military power in a multipolar world. It reflects the accumulated strategic depth of a nation that was sanctioned, threatened, and pressured for 40 years and responded by becoming more capable, not less. It reflects the reality that the global energy system, which the United States helped build and once dominated, now has pressure points that Washington cannot control simply by deploying carriers and launching airstrikes. Iran's chief negotiator said it was impossible for others to pass the strategic strait without Iran's consent. That is not just a negotiating position, that is a demonstrated operational reality. What happens next in Hormuz will define American credibility for a generation. The military options are ugly. More bombing risks full escalation. A ground or amphibious operation to seize Iranian coastal positions would be the most significant combat operation since Iraq in 2003, with all the catastrophic uncertainty that implies. Diplomacy requires concessions that the current Washington political environment makes nearly impossible to deliver. And every day of continued closure deepens the economic pain globally, increasing the pressure on all parties, but not guaranteeing that pressure translates into resolution. What you are living through right now is a turning point, not just in Middle Eastern geopolitics, but in the entire structure of the post-American century world order. The era when American military supremacy could be deployed to resolve geopolitical disputes quickly and decisively is colliding with the reality of adversaries who planned for exactly that supremacy and built the tools to neutralize it. The Sajjil-3 missile over the Strait of Hormuz is not just a weapons system. It is a message written in solid fuel and guidance electronics and decades of indigenous engineering, addressed directly to every admiral and every strategist who thought maximum pressure would break Iran before Iran broke the global economy. The world is reading that message now, one 130 barrel of oil at a time.